astronomers, all really important information to be able to monitor and improve the quality of at the moment.
Your device, the Lacuna transmitter, and the satellite it goes into space on, they're small. If I had one in front of me on a desk, what would it look like?
Yeah, so the sensor and the transmitter, it fits into the palm of your hand. And the remarkable thing about the technology is that will work and send messages back off of a single battery charge for several years.
And the satellite themselves are quite, the CubeSat that these things are attached to, that's small as well.
Yeah, this is one of the remarkable sort of innovations in the satellite world, is that we've been able to shrink the size of the satellites massively. We'll be able to do incredible things, and they're getting smaller and smaller all the time. Whereas, the early part of my career, I worked on satellites that were the size of double-decker buses and things. We're now down to things which are, like a shoebox size.
There are people who worry about the amount of satellites that we're putting into space. Astronomers are concerned. There's also a concern that we might get collisions between satellites and end up with particular orbits unusable because of the volume of space junk there. Is this a risk with these kind of microsatellites? That in a sense space is going to become incredibly crowded?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a valid concern. Still these things are incredibly spaced out. There is, excuse the pun, but there is a lot of space up there. But there are certain bands around, especially between 500 and 600 kilometres, that are very popular and very sort of heavily populated with satellites. So we have a lot of constraints that are placed on us before we launch. And we take those constraints very seriously. We have to make sure it's going into an orbit where there is a very, very low probability of a collision. We have to do all that analysis before we get the license to launch. And also, most importantly, we design all of our satellites so that they will naturally decay and fall back to Earth within 5 years. So in that way, we ensure that when we finish with them, when they stop doing their useful work, they do deorbit and get out of the way. And that's a requirement that is becoming very commonly placed upon the operators' satellites, and also to make sure that when they do degrade and when they sort of burn up in the atmosphere, they do properly burn up in the atmosphere, so they don't have any huge, heavy components on them. There's lots of regulations now. However, that doesn't help us with all the historic stuff that's been put up there. We have to live with that.
And that's Rob Spurrett telling me about what has been, so far, a successful launch. Well, we're almost at the end of this week's Tech Life. As ever, we're keen to hear your ideas for future programmes. If there's a story you'd like us to look into, please do get in touch. And do keep telling us about the tech you use, at home or at work. You can get in touch with us at techlife@bbc.co.uk or WhatsApp us on +44 330 1230 320. This week's programme was produced by Imran Rahman Jones, edited by Monica Soriano, and presented by Chris Vance.
This is the BBC World Service, where Ruth Evans is investigating why so many of Australia's animals are endangered.
Over 2,000 species on the continent are at risk of dying out.
We have the unenviable position of being the global leaders of modern mammal extinctions.
Why is this happening, and can things be turned around?
Australia's extinction crisis. At bbcworldservice.com/documentaries or where you get your BBC podcasts. 50 minutes. Witness history.
In 1995, the opening of a new transport system would forever change the lives of people in what was called the murder capital of the world. Medellin in Colombia was once one of the world's most dangerous places.
Next, it's Outlook. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
I'm Marcia Fuchs, and today on Outlook from the BBC World Service. As a teenager, Alistair Wood lived in a very unusual home, a top-secret training camp for spies.
It was strange. My mother at first would sort of say, keep away from the windows maybe, and avoid going out during the day. But after a while, I think people got used to seeing this sort of small boy around the place.
That's because most people Alistair knew at that age had worked for the UK's Secret Intelligence Service, including his mother and absent father.
Suddenly my father sort of resurfaced there, not physically, but I never heard any sort of talk about him at all. All the instructors in the camp had worked alongside him in Berlin at the height of the Cold War, and one or two of them had a very, very low opinion of him. I was well aware that there was a question mark hanging over my father.
Alistair searched for answers after the news.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. The US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has described the strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities as the most complex and secretive military operation in history, but he gave few new details about their impact. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane, said US forces employed 75 precision-guided weapons.
This included 14 30,000-pound GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrators, marking the first ever operational use of this weapon. The initial battle damage assessments indicate that all three sites sustained extremely severe damage and destruction.
The Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi has now acknowledged what he called serious damage from the strikes, saying an assessment was underway. The United States is to give $30 million in funding to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a controversial US and Israeli-backed body set up to distribute aid in Gaza. The GHF has been operating in the Strip since the end of May, following an 11-week aid blockade by Israel. Jake Kwan has this report from Washington.
This is the first known U.S. government funding of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Israel sees the organization as key to undermining Hamas' control of Gaza, but the UN and major aid groups have refused to cooperate with the food distribution system, accusing it of weaponizing aid. The group uses private U.S. military and logistics firms to bring food to Palestinians at what they call secure sites, but the UN has said that more than 410 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli gunfire or shelling since the group began work in late May.
The White House has said the United States and China have agreed on a framework aimed at implementing the trade deal reached in Geneva earlier this month. A Trump official said the framework lays the groundwork for expediting rare earth shipments from China to the US. The UN Special Rapporteur for Belarus has warned of a dire human rights situation in the country. Niels Muizhnieks told the UN Human Rights Council he was most concerned about the political persecution waged by the authorities.
Over the reporting period, the overall human rights situation continued to deteriorate, with new forms of repression added to old. The most worrying trend which has continued is political persecution of people for the legitimate and peaceful exercise of their civil and political rights.
Belarusian rights says more than 1,000 political dissidents have been locked behind bars. President Macron and Germany's Chancellor Merz have said the EU must reach a quick trade deal with the United States. They were speaking after an EU summit in Brussels, with less than 2 weeks to go before a US ultimatum to reach deals and ward off heavy tariffs. The bloc's leaders also agreed to extend sanctions on Russia for another 6 months. This is the latest world news from the BBC. Japan has executed a death row inmate for the first time in 3 years. Takahiro Shiraishi was arrested in 2017 after body parts were found in his flat. He was sentenced to death for murdering 9 people, mostly young women, in 2020. The 34-year-old was dubbed the Twiller after he admitted to approaching his victims on the social media platform. Mexico's lower house of Congress has approved legislation that bans entertainment events involving dolphins or other mammals, such as orcas and sea lions. Marine mammals will only be allowed to remain in captivity for the purpose of research or reproduction. Leonardo Rocha report.
Popular attraction in Mexican resorts such as Cancun and Cozumel, but for decades campaign groups have denounced the cruelty behind the profitable industry. They say the animals suffer because of chemicals in the swimming pools and often go blind. In a rare show of unity in Mexican politics, the Wildlife Reform Bill won unanimous support in the Chamber of Deputies. It had already passed the Senate and will now be signed into law by President Claudia Sheinbaum.
Mexico's financial regulators have intervened in 2 of 3 banks accused by the United States of laundering money for drug trafficking cartels. In a statement, they said the move was aimed at safeguarding the interests of account holders at Cibanco and Intercam. On Wednesday, the US banned some transactions with 3 Mexican financial institutions as part of wider sanctions against the production and illegal sale of fentanyl. The Grammy award-winning film composer Lalo Schifrin has died at the age of 93. Born in Argentina, Lalo Schifrin wrote era-defining music for films such as Cool Hand Luke and Dirty Harry, but his best-known piece was for television, the theme to Mission Impossible. He said his brief was for a theme that's exciting, promising, but not too heavy, and anticipates the action to follow. BBC News.
Hi, I'm Ossie Fuchs, and this is Outlook from the BBC World Service. The program that brings you the sorts of extraordinary stories that would stop any respectable dinner party in its tracks. On that note, let's jump straight into today's interview. Did you know as a kid that your family were all spies, or is that something you found out? And was there a moment when you were like, oh wow, they're not just accountants or secretaries, whatever it is people do?
Well, my mother was a secretary. Actually, like all kids, I wasn't that aware of certainly what my mother did, but clues kept sort of appearing. I would be digging up parts of old shortwave radios, and there was lots of camera equipment stuffed under the eaves. The occasional document would turn up marked top secret at the back of drawers. The occasional gun, even. So I sort of figured out that, it wasn't quite the normal sort of background.
That's Alistair Wood. And yes, a bunch of his family members, including both his parents, were spies. They worked for the SIS, the UK's secret intelligence service, perhaps better known as MI6.
My mother, right up to the day she died, never really talked about what she'd done. I was sort of aware that my father was not the complete package when it comes to fatherhood. I think about a month after I was born, he'd popped out saying he was going to get a loaf of bread and reappeared 20 years later. So I knew that he was not there was much to him, really.
So he disappeared not just on his own hook, he took your brother with him.
He took my brother with him.
Where did they go?
Well, didn't know to begin with. The police sort of figured out that they'd probably gone across to Ireland. But in the end, his car turned up at some docks. And we were able to trace him to Canada. And eventually, my mother managed to track him down, went to the west coast of Canada, retrieved my brother, came to England with brother.
How did she do that?
Well, now it starts getting slightly complicated in that my father's a Sufi, which is a sort of branch of Islam, and he wanted both mother and I to go to alternative education. So my brother was enlisted in the Steiner School, and therefore quite a clever local conveyancing lawyer figured out, well, he's probably registered for Steiner School in Canada then. So they inquired after the Canadian education authorities, who gave them a list of Steiner schools in Canada. There weren't that many. And sure enough, back eventually came this clue that he was enrolled in a Steiner school in Vancouver. My mother had been, and I'm going to put this in inverted commas, a secretary in Berlin in the height of the Cold War. So, she was more to her than just typing skills. So off she went to Canada, staked out where my brother was at school, followed him back, and let herself into this house and whipped him back, as her training would have allowed. So life sort of started new back in England with my mother, my brother and I.
The three of you, your father, was he ever talked about in the house? Did your mother ever say anything?
Never talked about. I mean, there was maybe a slight object of curiosity. My mother would occasionally get calls from the Russians who sort of asked, where is J.B. Wood? And my mother would just say, Well, I've no idea, but if you have more luck than me, perhaps you would be so good as to pass on the details, because I'd quite like to get hold of him, because brilliant linguist though he is, and one of the Foreign Office probably greatest linguists, he seemed able to manage alimony in any tongue, so it was a fairly impecunious upbringing. I think actually the Russian phone calls, which are fairly gentle in tone, they just literally sort of said, you know, where is he? This was quite useful because it sort of almost made my mother's plight, so she was sounded out for a job back with SS.
And in terms of just back to kind of domestic life for the three of you, you mentioned your dad wasn't great, you know, at paying alimony. Did you have enough to get by?
I mean, not to be confused as sort of genuine poverty or anything like that, but it was but all that would change when at the age of 13 my mother remarried, and I went to live in what certainly was for many years the SIS training camp within the four very high walls of the SIS training camp. I guess at the time it seemed like a sort of really off we went. There was no disguising what she did then, really.
So what were you told about this place?
Not much, but I sort of knew. I mean, even if you're 13, you sort of thought, yeah. Well, it had letters MTE over the entrance, which was military training. And I thought, yes, there's not many men in uniform there. In fact, there's none at all. So my mother was the only female employee. I mean, she sort of rather liked it. I mean, in SIS in those days had no female employees whatsoever, practically. The only way in was to be a secretary. There were one or two exceptions, but they very much were the exceptions. So, not that she was complaining too loudly. One of the letters I've read of hers to her aunt was that the ratio of men to women is 40-1. Bravo, life begins at 43, she said. So she rather liked it, yeah.
So this is, you know, SIS training facility, SIS training camp. What sort of training went on there?
Well, it had initially been an SOE, Special Operations Camp. So the sort of furniture there was fairly military. You know, there was an indoor firing range, there was a sort of stretch railway line for explosives training. They had this enormous, powerful sort of what they called the Fort Launch, which sort of went out to sea occasionally. So it was built on that basis, but SIS sort of reformed itself from the days of the Wild West to the sort of, you know, almost freewheeling frontline agents, and had become a much more sort of grown-up, responsible organisation. So most of the, what I call, for one of the better terms, students who came in sort of arrived on a Monday morning in this sort of blue transit van, and they would be wearing suits, and they would sort of file off into the accommodation blocks. And I think most of it was training fieldcraft rather than sort of firing off guns and all that sort of stuff. So there was a bit of that, you know. I mean, they learned how to sort of look after themselves, for want of a better term, yeah.
And what was it like for a young boy? I mean, it just sounds like heaven. Was it fun?
Well, no. I mean, in theory it was. I mean, it was, but I mean, I wasn't supposed to be there, really. I'm not too sure how I ended up there, almost by a process of sort of osmosis. Everyone in those days who was senior in SIS had seemed to have worked in Berlin during the height of the Cold War. So it was a sort of rather, I wouldn't call it a club, but they all knew each other. And I think they sort of thought, yes, a 13-year-old boy going to live in the camp might be a bit of a problem. But then they sort of, oh, well, no one need ever know, you know. So off I went. It was quite strange. My mother at first would sort of say, yes, keep away from the windows, maybe, and sort of avoid going out during the day. So I ended up being quite nocturnal, actually. I'd go to sleep at about sort of 2 a.m. and sort of wake up at trying to avoid it. was fine at weekends and things like that. But after a while, I think people got used to seeing this sort of small boy around the place.
But they were really sized at first. You get weird looks.
Well, the head guard, he would have sort of minor kittens, actually. He was made, I think he made an official complaint, and quite rightly so, given the nature of the establishment. But luckily, my stepfather was a fairly wonderful guy. Said, "Oh, don't worry about him. He's a pain to everyone." So I then spent the next 3 years, it seemed, trying to annoy this guy.
Oh, what would you do?
I'd always try and slip in and out of the place without anyone noticing. So they had this sort of low
Good
barrier.
luck, like run by a bunch of spies.
Yeah, my stepfather said it was quite good training for them all. So I used to sort of crouch down low on my bike and I'd zip underneath the single pole barrier, and I could glide silently out of the building. They had a sort of entrance tunnel, which during the summer months, if they got lazy, they'd leave it open. If not, there was a little simple inner door which had a sort of simple mortise lock, and I could just unlock that and be out. And so after a while, this got a bit annoying for them, understandably. So they did give me little things to do. So my brother and I were sort of tasked with sort of scraping down the hulls of yachts and things like that.
That's a really good strategy for annoying kids, to just give them a task.
Yes, I think so.
Learning with my toddler.
I was 13 and fairly, I wouldn't call it feral, but my mother had worked, and in those days she just shoved me out the front door, and you'd sort of just come back at tea time, really. So the idea of being encased in this camp was never going to work, really.
It was definitely a strange place to grow up. He wasn't evading the various spies and members of staff. Alistair remembers sitting down with his mom, brother, and others to watch the BBC drama Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. The TV show, which aired in the late 70s, was adapted from a book of the same name by former spy John le Carré, and told the story of the hunt for a suspected Soviet mole within the British Secret Agent Service. The drama hit quite close to home. At the time, SIS was still dealing with the fallout from the so-called Cambridge Five, a group of Cambridge graduates exposed as Soviet spies. Investigations into double agents within their ranks would consume British intelligence in the 1960s and well into the 70s.
Most of the instructors, certainly on a Monday night when the courses end, they would come round. My mother would normally have a sort of tea or maybe something slightly stronger. And so coincidentally at one stage the John le Carré Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy was on, and I happened to be there, probably there with some of the people that appeared in it, because they were just, the most senior people and probably the best.
And what did they think about seeing fictionalized versions of themselves on screen? Did they find it amusing?
I think that was the only time they ever expressed any interest. Certainly they would have never been to see a sort of James Bond film or anything like that. They were too sort of serious and intelligent, probably, without sounding too dismissive.
And so you're a teenager now, you're living in this camp, you're surrounded by sort of senior spies. Do you ever hear talk of your father? I mean, do you start to build more of a picture of what he did, of where he disappeared, of who he was?
It was strange because suddenly my father, sort of in a strange way, resurfaced there because, not physically, but I never any sort of talk about him at all. All the instructors in the camp had worked alongside him in Berlin at the height of the war, and one or two of them had a very, very low opinion of him. I was well aware that there was a question mark hanging over my father. He'd been expelled from, summarily dismissed from SIS.
You knew that as a teenager?
Yes, I did know that. It was never quite explained to me why he'd been dismissed.
And did you have any contact with him during this at all?
None whatsoever. He would occasionally send the odd sort of watch, $5 bills, things like that, sort of technically for our birthdays, but it never arrived anywhere near our birthdays. But they would be sort of covered in rather fabulous stamps, so I just thought, Yeah, he's living a rather exotic life. I'd sort of judge him through the colour of the stamps on the envelope, which seemed a lot more colourful and exotic than anything we had in the UK. But those sort of tapered off when my mother remarried, understandably.
And there weren't letters or anything, it was just...
No, nothing like that. Well, certainly none that I knew about, you know. It was, any contact was done through either the bank, the lawyer, or occasionally my mother had gone to see his mother, i.e. our grandmother, and tried to sort of wheedle some money out of her for our maintenance, basically, you know.
So by the time you're living at this training camp, you have a sense that, you know, your dad's maybe a little bit of a shady character. This is also, you know, by this time, there are all these stories coming out about, you know, double agents in the news, you know, notoriously Cambridge 5, and, you know, with your father being absent from your life, how did you make sense of what you were hearing, reading in the news? I mean, did you ever wonder what side he was really on?
Well, I fully expected him to be outed.
As a trainer?
Yeah, I sort of thought, you know, it's not looking good, is it? This prompted my stepfather, who was also intrigued, to be fair, because he'd heard a lot about J.B. Wood. So that prompted him to go and take us to see J.B. Wood's mother, who we'd never met. So that was quite interesting.
You finally got to meet him. I believe you were in your early 20s.
Yeah, his mother died. He wasn't expected back for the funeral. But no, we got there, and there he was, right in the front pew, waiting for us. And, you know, I would have had trouble recognizing him, obviously, but yeah, no, he was very pleased to see us, to be honest. I mean, he was sort of charming.
He was pleased to see you after 20 years.
Yeah. Well, he popped out for a loaf of bread 20 years beforehand, and frankly, yeah, it was as if the intervening 20 years hadn't been there, and the only surprise was he didn't bring back the loaf of bread 20 years later. So there he was. I mean, he was very sort of welcoming.
I mean, was it an emotional reunion? Did he hug you?
Not really. The British don't do that. Not that he was British. He was very welcoming, charming with them. I mean, you know, within the limits of a funeral service for his mother. We went off to lunch in a pub afterwards and chatted away.
About what? For 20
I don't know, small talk. I can't remember how of course, he wouldn't answer any question they're asked. He did sort of admit to where he'd come in from. I think he'd come from Zambia or somewhere. But that was as far as her questioning got. Very funny, because she was a very acerbically witty person, so she didn't waste any time sort of interrogating him and said, come on now, who are you married to now? You know, who's the latest, you know? And he would laugh it off, I'm not telling you. And I remember her saying, goodness knows you've been through worse interrogations than this, haven't you? And he did agree to that. So, yeah, they got on very well in a funny sort of way. It was, that in itself was rather surprising to me.
And I mean, you had 20 years, right, to think of what to ask him, what to say to him. Was that something you thought about? Were you like, gosh, if I ever meet my dad, I really want to say this, or I need to ask him this?
No, because we'd been forewarned that he was going to be difficult to deal with, because apart from anything else, I mean, he was a very intelligent man, and I think this is my brother's instructions. Let's stick to subjects we know something about. But that didn't work, because he knew more about everything with them.
What was the list of safe subjects?
My brother collected shells. He was a sort of amateur conchologist, but no, J.B. Wood knew every single shell, going the name of it in Latin and everything. So he was a sort of walking encyclopedia of knowledge. My stepfather afterwards, I remember him sort of giggling and saying he'd never met anyone that intelligent, and he was quite difficult to relate to, in the sense that, you know, he was this, I just think of him as a sort of walking brain, for want of a better term, but he was surprisingly open about his own background, particularly his time in Mexico. So he'd been in Mexico during the war and everything. And he talked quite a bit about having known Trotsky, Leon Trotsky. We talked, I guess, for about maybe
the exiled Russian revolutionary.
Yeah, so he talked quite a bit about having met Trotsky, or certainly having known him, and it was quite detailed description. It was very enjoyable, you know.
And I'm assuming there was no, like, heart-to-heart, sorry I disappeared and left you guys for 20 years.
No, as I said, I mean, the only thing, it was literally, he might just as easily have popped out for a loaf of bread, because he sort of wandered back in.
Was it just that evening you had together after the funeral, or was it?
No, he stayed a few days, yeah. So, you know, it was good value of, you know, he certainly wasn't a dull person.
So your grandmother, who just died, your father's mother, she had named you and your brother in her will, kind of bypassing your dad. And it's a little complicated, but he'd left a box of things, like a crate of things in storage.
Yeah.
And then, so when she died, that box of his items didn't go to him. It went to you and your brother. So what was in that crate?
When we've been clearing out my grandmother's stuff, to the surprise of the lawyer, out of the rubbish tip of stuff to be thrown out, mostly packing cases and stuff, I found this sort of blackened cross-shaped object, and I was about to bung that out, and he came along, wiped it on his sleeve, and his OBE, which is the Medal of Order of the British Empire medal, which he got for building the Berlin Tunnel, being involved in the Berlin Tunnel, but he obviously had very little interest in it. You know, that side of him had gone. Over the years, because he never really lived anywhere for very long, he'd occasionally drop bits and pieces back at his mother's house. But they were all in storage and always had been. And unknown to her, she'd been paying for him to have all this stuff in storage for probably 20, well, mostly, certainly since the sort of, I don't know, probably the 1930s or whatever. There were little bits and pieces there. So technically they were in his mother's name, everything, and she'd been paying for it, and now we were paying for it. So the lawyer said, yeah, well, technically they belong to you now. So this windfall sort of landed in our laps. Suddenly we had bits and pieces, you know, little bits of ephemera from his early childhood, probably all that he had in his pockets at the time he went to see his mother. He just sort of bunged away. But it did give an extraordinary insight into the life of a frontline agent. And so, you know, without this windfall, I would have known next to nothing about him, really.
Did it feel significant at the time to come into possession of this box of things?
Yes, I mean, probably significant when he was very annoyed that we got hold of them back.
Did he?
Yes, he was he was very annoyed about that. My brother blamed me. Yes, with my permission, I said, okay, I'll take the rap for this. So suddenly I was, for a couple of years, I was persona non grata. So most of it was unintelligible to us, because it was in various foreign languages, concerned a lot of material that I knew nothing about. So for a long time, these files that were fairly impenetrable gathered dust on top of various wardrobes.
It would be many more years before Alistair would dust off those crumpled old files and begin exploring the secrets within. That's in part 2 of Outlook. Stay with us. This is the BBC World Service, with journalist Megha Mohan exploring trans rights in the US military.
In late February, the US Defense Department ordered transgender people out of the military, regardless of ability, rank, or service history.
We will get transgender ideology the hell out of our military. It's going to be done.
Over the last 4 months, I've been following the stories of 2 trans service people as that ban took effect.
I don't want to be part of an organization that wants me to die for other people's ability to speak freely. Doesn't want the same right. There will inevitably be this question of who am I without the Navy?
Ban. To listen, search the documentary online or wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
In part 2 of Outlook from the BBC World Service, Alistair uncovers his father's secret world, including his role in some of the Cold War's most audacious missions, like the notoriously compromised Berlin Tunnel.
The British always assumed that there had been a leak. Very few people knew about the operation, probably a handful of people.
Including your mother and father?
Yeah.
Or two of that handful?
Yeah.
So, was J.B. Wood the mole? Find out after the news.
BBC News with David Harper. The Iranian foreign minister has acknowledged what he calls serious damage was done to the country's nuclear sites during the recent US and Israeli bombings. Abbas Araghchi said Iran's Atomic Energy Organization was carrying out a detailed assessment. His comments came as Washington doubled down on its assertion that its strikes on Iran severely undermined Tehran's nuclear ambitions. The U.S. State Department says it's approved $30 million in funds for the Humanitarian Foundation, the controversial U.S.-Israeli-backed body set up to distribute aid in the territory. It's the first known direct U.S. funding for the group. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed near its collection points, reportedly in Israeli firing. Officials in Gaza say Israeli airstrikes on Thursday killed at least 40 Palestinians. They said 7 sites were struck, including a busy market. The White House says the US and China have reached a framework agreement on implementing the trade deal reached in Geneva this month. China agreed to ship rare earth metals to the US in exchange for better access to US computer chips. The leaders of France and Germany have called on the European Commission to reach a quick trade deal with Washington. It's less than 2 weeks till a US deadline for agreements to be reached and big tariffs to be avoided. Japan has executed a death row inmate for the first time in 3 years. Takehiro Shiraishi was convicted of murdering 9 people in 2020. Mexico has taken action over 2 banks the US accused of laundering money for drug cartels. They have refrained from acting against a third. Both houses of Congress in Mexico have now approved legislation that bans entertainment events involving dolphins and other sea mammals. Campaigners have denounced the industry as cruel. The Grammy Award-winning film composer Lalo Schifrin has died at the age of 93. The Argentina-born Oscar nominee was best known for composing the theme to Mission Impossible. And that's the latest BBC News.
Welcome back to Outlook with me, Asya Fuchs. Today we're bringing you the story of Alistair Wood and his family of spies. In part 1, he grew up in a British Secret Intelligence Service training camp with his mother and older brother. Alistair's father, J.B. Wood, who was also a spy but had been fired from the SIS, had left the family when Alistair was a baby. He said he was off to buy a loaf of bread, but vanished for 20 years. Decades later, in the late 1990s, when Alistair learned that his father had died in Bosnia, he decided to piece together the life of the man he barely knew. And he wasn't the only one interested in J.B. Wood's final years.
When I informed SIS of his death, I immediately got a call to go and see Harold Shergold, who was this significant character in the history of SIS. What he really wanted to know was what J.B. Wood had been doing in the sort of 40 years since his dismissal from SIS, and more significantly, for whom perhaps I might be able to fill in the details. So what was good about that?
He was giving you an assignment, kind of.
Pretty much, yeah. We had 2 8-hour sessions where he sort of told me what he knew. The reasons for his FIS, for his suspicions about him, and through all of those, he wasn't entirely convinced either way, but it was a warts and all portrayal.
Either way, as in...
Which side he was batting on, for want of a better term, you know. He was always a figure of mystery and intrigue.
And was that kind of the central question that you had as you kind of set off on this quest to find out about your dad? Which side was he really on?
I was more intrigued by ascertaining simple facts. What nationality was he? What he was doing? I guess what intrigued me was, from a family point of view, what made him turn out the way he did, because, you know, he clearly was a very individual.
So what nationality was he?
Well, he started off as British, but then reinvented himself as Norwegian, and then became Canadian. So, you know, he had various passports, and he denied ever being British, or certainly didn't like being British. Yeah.
So, where do you begin? You decide you're going to look into him. How do you start?
Well, I had all my documents. He had been in most parts of the world in various guises, and luckily in my own job I would travel the world quite a bit, so I would always tack on an extra day to go and interview people. And this opened up a whole new world to me, which was, you know, it was fascinating.
Tell me about his early life. Where was he born?
He didn't have a normal childhood. He'd actually be born in Herefordshire, which sounds, can't get more English or normal than that. But it didn't last. His father came back from the First World War. He decided to go and emigrate to Canada, but then just didn't stop at Canada, and basically spent the first 12, 13 years of his son's life travelling the globe. And because he had no formal education, they used to encourage him to learn the language of whatever country they were in. And if they were on board ship, which they were for vast periods of time, he would learn the language of whatever the crew spoke. So he became fascinated by language. But really, crucially, it was on board ship that he learned to use shortwave radio. So there were two facts to this. One is that was his only means of contacting the real world. But B, on board these ships as a sort of school kid, or not school kid, there were no replacement parts, so he learned very early on to build his own replacement parts for radios. So
he just taught himself all of this, the languages, the radio stuff.
Yeah, so if you want the makings of a perfect spy, you know, by the time he was sort of came back to the UK, I think he was 12, 13, he already spoke about 4 languages pretty much fluently. He taught at a language school in Sweden, and so at the age of 21 he left Cambridge. He'd already become a Sufi, changed nationality to be Norwegian, became a full-time Sufi, pacifist, vegetarian. You know, he went the whole hog.
Completely enthralled by this mystical branch of Islam, J.B. Wood would be a lifelong convert, and his Sufism would be a guiding principle in a lot of what he did. So he was already a pretty eccentric character, polyglot, Herefordshire boy turned Norwegian Sufi, and he continued to travel, picking up languages as he went. But before long, World War II had begun. Soon enough, J.B. Wood's unique skill set caught the attention of the British intelligence service. Despite his initial reluctance, and after some thorough training, he was dispatched as a frontline agent.
When I was talking to him, I asked him in a sort of schoolboyish type way, you know, what was the most dangerous place you'd been? And he'd been pretty much to every dangerous place. And without moments, what he said, Buenos Aires during the war. And I mean, the Germans, you know, they had hundreds of agents there, and the British. So literally, he was having to change hotels all the time and always sit with his back to the wall. You know, I really scraped the surface of what went on there. But he managed to get out just in time with his first wife.
Fast forward a little bit to after the war. Your brother ends up in post-war Berlin, you know, sort of center of spycraft back then, which is where he meets your mother, Margaret. How do they meet? We know about their sort of early romance.
My mother was pulled into SIS very young age. Shortly after her 21st birthday, she headed out to Berlin. She was a sort of young ingenue. She was working for Harold Shergold, who was the station chief. So she was pretty much his, for want of a better term, secretary, you know. So she had to sit and do her shorthand and take down the notes of all what they were doing. She would occasionally get called on to do other tasks. J.B. Wood, in the meantime, was a frontline agent there, which is very different from most of the sort of spies one reads about. So he probably found the Russian sector than the British or American or French sectors of Berlin, which at the time was a divided city. So he was sort of ferrying radios across to people in the Russian sector and getting out and basically having to deal with the Russians on a daily basis, because the Cold War was reaching its really the sort of zenith at that time. And the feeling was that Russia would invade at any moment, certainly invade Berlin, which at the time was cut off from Western Germany, was 100 miles inside Russian-occupied Eastern Germany. So they sort of thought, well, it's only a matter of time. They blockaded the place. And most importantly for the Western allies, the West didn't have a single spy operating in the Soviet part of Berlin or anywhere actually, so they had no idea what the Russians are up to. So the rough plans were made to build some sort of tunnel. My mother was then employed to do the sort of rough recce's, where to build a tunnel. And the place where the KGB, NKVD lines ran closest is obviously in the middle of town. That was sort of complicated, and so she would just wander across into the Russian zone, quite innocently take photos of the possible places they could build a tunnel. But the problem with that was, when they thought about it, you know, the idea of removing 100 tons of soil, the equivalent of, you know, the middle of Manhattan or London or Paris, was, you know, isn't going to work. They'd be spotted immediately. So they then found that there was a place about 15 miles, 10 miles to the south of the centre of Berlin, where the Russian telecommunication lines ran quite close to a road. There were about 3 lines running together, so they thought, well, here is more out of the way, but it's a long, long way away. How the hell are we going to tunnel that far? So, cut a long story short, they decided the best thing to do would be to get my mother involved. In the meantime, JB Wood, my father, had gone out to have a look at the site. And here's where the beginning of my father's problems really began, because they did this recce of the site. Shergold was head of station, and, you know, they had to walk hundreds of yards into the Russian zone, and Shergold, even 50 years later, sort of said he felt extremely uncomfortable, the head of station, one of the most senior officers, wandering around in the middle of the Russian zone for no good reason. But what struck Shergold then, and still struck him 50 years later, was that J.B. Wood, my father, for him it was just a walk in the park. He couldn't understand how anyone could be that blasé. So this sort of planted the seed in Shergold's mind that something was wrong here. Nevertheless, the tunnel operation went ahead. My mother would go out into the Russian zone with a man called Shoebottom and pose as a romantic couple. So they would meet up, and she would carry a metal tray or something, while the surveyors used that to use their distancing, their sighting and everything to figure out the best path to build a tunnel. So that was her sort of job.
Did she ever tell you if that was frightening for her?
No, she never talked about that. I only discovered all this after she died, both from her husband, my stepfather, and from Shergold himself. So she never ever mentioned it. She made a few acerbic remarks about the Berlin Tunnel. She would sort of always say, yes, it's funny how everyone claims credit for the operation apart from the people that actually worked on it, things like that. And so, you know, they pressed ahead with this plan to build this enormous tunnel, which worked. The Americans came in, financed it, and the real value of it was that just from the small talk of Russians, the Russian officers that they managed to tap into, they knew from the small talk that no invasion was planned and they could relax. So it was a fairly invaluable operation.
Operation Stopwatch, or Operation Gold, was a massive joint project between the SIS and the CIA, building a 1,500-foot-long tunnel running under the most heavily patrolled border at the time, between East and West Berlin. With the tunnel underway, J.B. Wood was reassigned to Finland.
So he arrives in Finland. I mean, the Russians would have known who he was immediately. And then it all went to hell in a handcart, as one of my mother's phrases. Yeah, everything collapsed. There was a sort of assassination attempt on him. He managed to survive that. The official answer was that his cover was blown and therefore they had to pull him out. I don't think anyone really believed that entirely, including my mother, but no one really knew what had happened. And about the time that this had all happened, the Russians revealed the Berlin Tunnel. The two events sort of coincided. This seems a coincidence too far for the sort of people who didn't really believe in coincidence by training. The British always assumed, as did the Americans, that there had been a leak on the British side. And very few people on the British side actually knew about the operation. So there's basically probably a handful of people.
Including your mother and father?
Yeah.
Or two of that handful?
Yeah. So he was pulled in for questioning and expelled from SIS, being the likely suspect for having betrayed the Berlin Tunnel. And he disappeared off to Canada, taking my brother with him. And that suspicion never went away, really.
J.B. Wood stayed in Canada for a few years, where he became a teacher of international politics. He kept his head down, tried to brush off the accusations. And then, in 1961, a member of the Secret Intelligence Service named George Blake was arrested and confessed to being the double agent responsible for passing on information about the Berlin Tunnel. For J.B. Wood, who'd always maintained his innocence, the revelations brought some level of personal vindication, though as we heard in part one, rumors and suspicions swallowed him for the rest of his life. So, once again, J.B. Wood reinvented himself and became a humanitarian, working with the UN in Saigon and other conflict zones.
The saintly side of him, the sort of pacifist, occupied as many years as his work as a spy. He became an extraordinary sort of aid worker. That was his real career, and his work as a spy was sort of foisted on him because of war and the Cold War. Admittedly, he was rather well suited to it. So really, he spent the last 30 years of his life going into places where no one else would go, frankly, you know, and helping some of the neediest people on the planet, and ended up in Bosnia, in the middle of the Bosnian War. And there he was killed. I think it was just a traffic accident, car overturned, and an enormous funeral. And the striking thing is that he has a magnificent tomb
in Bosnia.
in Bosnia. And he's buried in Medjugorje, which is sort of second only to Lourdes as the sort of shrine, Catholic shrine. So there are about 3 million visitors a year go there, and to the church where he's buried. But there's a very small cemetery. There's only about 100 graves in him. You know?
And, I mean, all these years of searching, do you feel like, you know, searching for your dad in a way, do you feel like you found what you were looking for?
No, I wanted to know what had made him turn out the way he did. And for the life of me, because, you know, I seemed to have rather nice parents. I met his mother and she was great. I guess it must have just been his childhood. I mean, quite prosaic things, quite dull things like, I mean, if you don't have other school kids sort of rounding you into shape, then you maybe head off in your own direction, never to be corrected. And if you've traveled around the world literally non-stop for the first 12, 13 years of your life, then maybe you're never going to settle in one place. But he led an extraordinary life, and I've really enjoyed sort of uncovering it from a distance, and what I was always been told was a safe distance, which is true.
My thanks to Alistair Wood. He's written a book called My Family and Other Lies. That's all we have time for today on Outlook. For me, Asya Pook, and the Outlook team, thanks for listening.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, and now witness history with me, Tim O'Callaghan. In 1995, the opening of a new transport system would forever change the lives of people in what was called the murder capital of the world. Medellin in Colombia was once one of the world's most dangerous places. In the 1980s and 90s, news reports coming out of the country all followed a similar theme.
The drugs war in Colombia has reached such depths of terrorism that even senior officials feel unable to speak openly.
The law is under siege in Colombia. We must protect in any way we can. Colombia's Justice Minister stated today in Washington.
Violence which surrounds the cocaine trade has turned Medellin into the murder capital of the world.
A title that no city would want to claim. But just a few years later, a new chapter in history was opened for Medellin, and it began with a train network.
That was a mixture of relief, but at the same time, a very exciting moment. You realize the operation starts and never ends to run. The operation go from this moment on continually.
That's Tomás Andrés Alhalde, who is the general manager of the Medellin metro system. The opening of the network was a big event. Promotional videos were broadcast.
El metro de Medellín es una realidad.
And the opening was attended by Colombia's president, with speeches and musical performances delivered to the crowds waiting to board the first trains. Tomás didn't get to see any of that though. He was in the control room, with arguably the biggest job of the day.
I have the responsibility to give the train drivers and all the personnel of the stations the orders to open the stations, to start to run the trains with passengers for the first time at all. And that's what a very impressive moment, because this is a moment that you get the authorization before that from the president of the nation itself.
En nombre de todos los antioqueños.
On behalf of all the people of Antioquia, and in my capacity as the President of Colombia, I authorize the launch of our Medellin Metro.
I was the person that get this order and transferred this order to all the people in the operation, in the station and in the trains.
A joyous moment for Tomás and the city. But it was very nearly a different story.
The biggest problem that we have in the 90s was a financial problem. We start the construction of the metro system in Medellin about 1988, and reaching 1990 we have a financial crisis, and we have also problems with the taxes in the central government of Colombia, and that's actually stopped the construction for about 4 to 5 years. That was a very sad moment for all of us in the city. You see all the stations unfinished, and it was a very bad sight for all of us.
Although the problems with the construction of the metro had been resolved, new hitches would soon emerge.
We got some technical problems at the beginning between the interface from the tracks to the wheels of the trains, because of the design of the tracks were from Spain, and the building of the tracks and all that, the viaducts and the line were built by Spanish companies, and the trains came from Germany. Both didn't exactly run well on each other. And actually, British companies and British specialists help us to find the solution of these problems.
Medellin is situated in a long, narrow valley, about 1,500 meters above sea level. As the population reached 1 million in the 1970s, people had to start building their homes up on the sides of the mountains that surround the city. These neighborhoods, or barrios as they are known in Colombia, quickly became some of the poorest in Medellin, with high crime rates fueled by drug wars engulfed the city in the 1980s and 90s.
Central to the conflict is Pablo Escobar, leader of the Medellin cartel and Colombia's most feared criminal. Cocaine dealing transformed him from car thief into one of the world's richest men. Escobar's achievement is still respected in the barrios of Medellin. These districts have spawned the sicarios, contract killers who will murder for as little as £50. The combination of sicarios and drug money are at the heart of Colombia's crisis.
Escobar was infamous throughout the world. It's estimated 70 to 80 tons of cocaine were shipped into the United States every month by his organization. Since his death in 1993, the homicide rate in Medellin has been steadily falling, and money has been spent on projects to improve the city, including greatly expanding the metro. The problem was, a traditional train couldn't reach the poorest people on the mountainsides.
We know about a system in Portugal, in Funchal, in the island of Madeira. That was the first system that we visit. It's a system that at the time was very new. It's a cable car system over the neighborhoods, and that we realized that that could be the possibility. But the system in Madeira was a tourist system that only functioned 5 to 6 hours a day and have many days closed and so on. So we began to think with the constructors of this cable car system to develop the possibility to have a system that functions year around. And this is the way that we came to this idea, to the metro cable.
The majority of the routes on the metro system are now metro cables.
They were very, very hard because these stations are located in very deep areas that has almost no streets to reach them, and there were very, very heavy equipment to put in these stations. That was a very, very challenging process. In one particular line, we need also helicopters to carry the towers to sustain the cable cars.
The metro has been a huge success for Medellin. There are more than 1 million journeys taken every day, and the inhabitants of the city are very proud of it. But it remains the only system of its type in Colombia, something Tomás thinks is an issue for the country.
We feel proud, but we think that is not the ideal situation. We have to help to convince the politicians that building a transportation system like a metro is expensive, of course, but it's more expensive not to have a metro system.
Medellin has become a tourist hotspot, something that was unimaginable 30 years ago when it was known as the murder capital of the world. The metro has played a big part in this, but Tomás doesn't think people realised the difference it would make when it opened in 1995.
I think for the common people in Medellin, it was actually a very big moment, but I don't think they realized that it was a shifting moment for the city.
Tomás Andrés Alajalde is the general manager of the Medellin Metro. He was speaking to me, Tim O'Callaghan, for Witness History.
This is the BBC Gilbert to tell us about July's World Book Club.
Graham Burnet's novel His Bloody Project follows a young man accused of triple murder in 19th century Scotland. As witness accounts and his unsettling personal confession unfold, the truth is bent and distorted. In a system where justice favours those in power, does the truth stand a chance?
World Book Club from the 5th of July. In 30 minutes, Heart and Soul.
Praise You is a world-famous dance track from the English DJ Fatboy Slim, but the true meaning of the lyrics has been forgotten. I'm Emily Webb, and I'm in New York, meeting the 91-year-old civil rights activist and singer who wrote the music as a love letter to black men.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello. What impact did America's strikes on Iran really have? For Washington, it's clear.
I can say here that the assessment is that we significantly damaged the nuclear program, setting it back by years. I repeat,
years.
Tehran dismisses those claims. Also today at 3 hours GMT on the newsroom with me, Nick Miles. Washington says the US and China have agreed how to implement a trade deal. We get the details. After 40 years of Kurdish insurgency against Ankara, a peace process, but many are sceptical.
There are so many mothers like me. I know a family who hasn't seen their son in 13 years. At the beginning we were hopeful, but now it's just talk. No real steps taken.
Later on, after almost 4 decades in charge at US Vogue, why is Anna Wintour standing down? And we pay tribute to the man who brought us this. Film composer Lalo Schifrin, after this. Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. The United States is to give $30 million in funds to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a controversial American and Israeli-backed body set up to distribute aid in Gaza. It's the first known direct US funding for the group. The GHF, backed by armed US contractors and Israeli troops, has been operating in the Strip since the end of May, following an 11-week aid blockade by Israel. Our correspondent in Washington, John Donnison, says there have been fatalities during aid distribution.
Over the past couple of months since May, more than 400 Palestinians have been shot and killed while trying to get aid from those limited distribution centres run by this foundation. We've seen truly desperate scenes of Palestinians scrambling to get food, running across large open areas of land to try and get to these trucks, and many of them getting killed and injured.
The Iranian foreign minister has admitted that what he called serious damage was done to the country's nuclear sites during the recent US and Israeli bombings. Abbas Araghchi said Iran's Atomic Energy Organization was carrying out an assessment. His comments came as Washington doubled down on its insistence that its strikes badly undermined Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Mr. Araghchi accused the US of blocking progress on talks about its nuclear program.
ببینید ما داشتیم با آمریکا مذاکره می‌کردیم اسرائیل میز رو
Look, we were negotiating with America. Israel destroyed the table. Then we were talking to Europe. The Americans destroyed it. So I say those who say let's go back to the negotiating table should specify exactly which table they mean and with what specifications.
The White House says the United States and China have agreed on a framework aimed at implementing a trade deal reached in Geneva earlier this month. A Trump administration official says groundwork for expediting rare earth shipments from China to the US. Earlier, President Trump said he'd signed a deal with Beijing on Wednesday, but gave no further details. France's President Macron and Germany's Chancellor Merz have said the EU must reach a quick trade deal with the United States. They were speaking after an EU summit in Brussels with less than 2 weeks to go before a US ultimatum to reach deals and ward off hefty tariffs. The EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said EU-US talks would continue.
Today we received the latest US document for further negotiations. We are assessing it. So our message today is clear. We are ready for a deal. At the same time, we are preparing for the possibility that no satisfactory agreement is reached, and we will defend the European interest as needed. In short, all options remain on the table.
The bloc's leaders also agreed to extend sanctions on Russia for another 6 months, but Slovakia, which is sympathetic to the Kremlin, blocked a possible new sanctions package. You're listening to the latest world news from the BBC. The UN Special Rapporteur for Belarus has warned of a dire human rights situation there. Niels Muizhnieks told the UN Human Rights Council that conditions were continuing to deteriorate with no signs of improvement. He said he was most concerned about the political persecution waged by the authorities. Belarus has been under the ruthless rule of the authoritarian leader Alexander Lukashenko for more than 3 decades. The US Immigration Enforcement Agency says a Canadian citizen who's also a US permanent resident has died under custody at an ICE detention center in Florida. Johnny Noviello was found unconscious at the facility and later pronounced dead on Monday. Noviello, who'd lived nearly 40 years in the US, was facing deportation over a 2023 conviction for racketeering and drug trafficking charges. Mexico's lower house of Congress has approved legislation that bans entertainment events involving dolphins and other mammals. Dolphin shows, where tourists pay to swim and take pictures with the animals, are popular attractions in Mexican resorts. The Grammy award-winning film composer Lalo Schifrin has died at the age of 93. Born in Argentina, Lalo Schifrin wrote era-defining music, films such as Cool Hand Luke and Dirty Harry, but his best-known piece was for television. Claire Nickers looks back at his life.
As a child, Boris Claudio Schifrin played classical piano, but by his early 20s, he was in Paris playing jazz. He moved to America and wrote for Hollywood, his percussive, jazzy style in demand in the 60s and early 70s in films such as Dirty Harry and the Steve McQueen classic Bullet. But his biggest hit was for the small screen in 1966 with Mission Impossible in an unusual 5/4 time signature, which was later updated for the film franchise.
And that's the latest BBC News.
Hello and welcome to the newsroom on the BBC World Service with me, Nick Miles. Last weekend's US military strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities were unprecedented and hugely significant. Even some Iranian officials admit they caused considerable damage. But had they seriously disrupted Tehran's nuclear program? Well, the debate on that goes on. On Thursday, the US Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, insisted the bombing operations was a resounding success that had set back Iran's nuclear ambitions by years. He also downplayed the results of a preliminary report by US intelligence officials suggesting the damage caused may have been less extensive than anticipated. Our security correspondent Frank Gardner reports.
With the dust now settling after America's extraordinary long-range strike on Iran's underground nuclear enrichment facility at Fordow, the battle of competing narratives has begun as to just how effective the US air raid really was. At a Pentagon press conference, the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth dismissed a leaked preliminary report that had suggested Iran's nuclear program had only been set back by a few months. The raid was, he insisted, a resounding and historic success.
There's been a lot of discussion about what happened and what didn't happen. Step back for a second. Because of decisive military action, President Trump created the conditions to end the war, decimating, choose your word, obliterating, destroying Iran's nuclear capabilities. I can say here that the assessment is that we significantly damaged the nuclear program, setting it back by years. I repeat, years.
But no one from either the US or from the UN's nuclear watch has seen for themselves what state the vast subterranean centrifuge hall is in, hundreds of feet beneath the mountain at Fordow. The likelihood is that the massive bunker-busting bombs, dropped with pinpoint precision down 2 ventilation shafts, will have seriously damaged or destroyed those centrifuges. But then there is the 400 kilos of unaccounted for, highly enriched uranium, a key ingredient for a nuclear bomb. There has been minimal radiation leakage at Fordow, so where is it now? Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, claimed that Iran had somehow won this conflict and that the US had failed. For now, the bombs and missiles may no longer be falling, but there is still jeopardy here for both Iran and Israel. The latter is going to be watching the Islamic Republic like a hawk for any signs that it's reconstituting its suspect nuclear program. And Iran could still go either way, returning to talks or even withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and risking a new round of attacks.
Frank Gardner. Well, as we heard earlier, some Iranian officials have acknowledged that Washington inflicted considerable damage. But in an address to the nation, the Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, said the strikes amounted to little more than showmanship by President Trump.
The President of the United States exaggerated events in unusual ways, and it turns out he needed this exaggeration. Anyone who's heard these words has understood there is another truth behind them. The US has failed to take action and has not achieved their intended objective.
Well, the Iranian capital Tehran is now coming back to life after the bombings. Our international correspondent Lise Doucette is being allowed to report in Iran on condition that none of her reports are used on the BBC's Persian service. This law from the Iranian authorities applies to all international media agencies operating.
It was a defiant speech, an angry speech. He declared that the Islamic Republic of Iran would never surrender to the United States. He accused of the United States of being hostile to Iran ever since the Iranian Revolution of
1979. It has to be said that the 86-year-old Ayatollah has never trusted the United States, even when they were in negotiations over a nuclear deal. And after the events of the past few weeks, that distrust runs very, very deep. And we happened to watch his speech in a destroyed section of the state TV compound that had been targeted by an Israeli missile. They said they were taking aim at the propaganda arm of the Islamic regime. And the main studio, which should have aired the Supreme Leader's speech, is now just a black hole, completely reduced to ash when a fire swept through a vast section of that complex. And that darkness just seemed to symbolize the darkness of this moment now facing Iran. And however defiant the Supreme Leader, the final authority here on all matters, is in public, in private, he is facing some of the most difficult and dangerous decisions of his nearly 40 years at the helm. And everyone we meet here, whether they support the government or not, they express enormous relief that there is this ceasefire. It's holding. But they all, to a person, they say they worry that war will erupt again. Still, you can feel the city's slowly returning, at least on the surface, to its normal rhythms. More people are coming back to the city. More shops are opening, with Iranians telling us that, you know, they as hard as it was to stay away, they know it's going to be hard here, but they want to be here with their neighbors and family as they all worry about what the future will bring.
That was Lee's just said. Or for on the reaction in Tehran to the recent conflict with Israel, go to the BBC website, bbc.com/news. You can read about the wave of arrests and executions even of people suspected of links to Israeli intelligence. Now, after months of tariffs and counter-tariffs, have China and America finally come up with the details of a trade deal? Well, President Trump says a framework for a deal made last month has now been finalized. His remarks came during an event held at the White House to push Congress to approve his tax and spending bill.
Remember a few months ago, the press was saying, do you really have anybody of any interest? Well, we just signed with China yesterday, right? Just signed with China. We have everybody. We're not going to make deals with everybody. Some we're just going to send them a letter, say, thank you very much. You're going to pay 25, 35, 45%. That's the easy way to do it. My people don't want to do it that way. They want to do some of it, but they want to make more deals than I would do. But we're having some great deals. We have one coming up, maybe with India, very big one, where we're going to open up India. In the China deal, we're starting to open up China.
Well, to get more clarity on that China deal, I'm heard from our correspondent in Washington, Jake Kwan.
This information came in a very brief moment during President Trump's long speech on the big spending bill, but he took a few seconds to talk about how he signed a deal yesterday with China and that he will sign another one with India soon. But what we've heard from the White House later, I mean, information is still very sparse, but this deal has to do with the rare earth metal. Now, remember, America and China has been engaged in a trade war, but there was a breakthrough in May where two sides agreed to take down their tariffs, and this breakthrough was soon breaking down over China accusing America over that it had stopped the sale of semiconductor chips, and America accused China of stopping the sale of rare earth metals. And then 2 weeks ago, the two sides had met again in London to work out this, what they call a framework deal, where those ingredients will start flowing again. So they ironed out that issue. And what seems to have happened is that they have finalized that framework deal.
And Jake, remind us what these rare earth elements are and why they're so important to America and other countries.
So these are metal that China is really controlling a majority of the raw ingredient, and they're controlling even a bigger share of it in processing it. So China holds almost a very dominant supply of these ingredients that is really critical to making any modern machinery, whether it's sensors, or whether it's magnets, or many modern machinery. And you can imagine these things are critical to making even weapons. Maybe it's a fighter jet, or etc. So it's a very important item to American manufacturers. Now, China has throttle the supply of them to America, according to Americans, and this has become really a big issue, and this was really the thing that America has accused China of what they would call these indirect tariff barrier, indirect trade barrier. So this has been one of the biggest issue between America and China, and the fact that this has been ironed out goes pretty well for the trade war, the resolving of the trade war between these two countries going forward.
At the risk of perhaps getting ahead of ourselves, you're saying this looks like a relatively stable deal because they both get what they want.
Yes, but at the same time, we have to remember that this is what they call a framework deal. Other officials have referred to this as a sub-deal. So the actual final deal where they put the ink on the paper and say that, the trade war between the U.S. and China has been fully resolved, I think that is something completely different. Maybe we'll need to see more of how we get there, but it really seems like a really solid middle step.
Jake Kwan, you're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. Now, the United States says it's approved direct funding for the Israel-supported relief initiative in the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, backed by armed contractors with the Israeli troops on the perimeter, began operations at the end of May. But they have been marred by chaotic scenes, deaths, and concerns about neutrality. Here's the State Department spokesman, Tommy Pickett.
Ultimately, we want to see aid reach the people of Gaza. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation delivered 46 million meals. We've seen that. We want to see that food being delivered. We see the $30 million approved. So that's what the story is here. Moving to implement, get those creative solutions in there to make sure that the aid being distributed is not being looted.
Well, on Thursday, the Hamas-run health authority said Israeli airstrikes killed more than 50 Palestinians in Gaza. Our correspondent Mark Lowen is in Tel Aviv.
While the ceasefire with Iran is still in place, it is hoped that maybe it could provide momentum to end the war in Gaza, and yet the killings there still go on. Dozens more killed, according to the local authorities in Gaza, many of them killed at aid distribution points. This very controversial US-Israeli aid mechanism where there are killings and deaths every day. The Trump administration says that a deal could be very close to end the war in Gaza. But even though the regional mediation has been stepped up, we understand both sides, Israel and Hamas, still have very, very many obstacles between them. Notably, Hamas's demand that a ceasefire could lead to a permanent end to the war in Gaza. That is something that the far right of Benjamin Netanyahu's cabinet fiercely opposes.
Mark Lowen. The foreign ministers of Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo are expected to sign a historic deal in Washington later on Friday to end fighting in the mineral-rich border region between the two countries. President Trump has taken credit for that deal, saying he had stopped a very vicious war. The BBC's Anne Soy reports.
The U.S. administration has been mediating talks between the DRC and neighboring Rwanda, which is accused of backing M23 rebels who've seized swathes of Congolese territory. Rwanda denies the claim. Details of the deal are not yet clear, but U.S. President Donald Trump has hailed the agreement, which he says will end fighting in the mineral-rich region. The deal is due to be unveiled at a ceremony at the White House. The events are expected to culminate later in a meeting of the heads of state. Congolese President Felix Tshisekedi revealed in February that he'd offered the U.S. a stake in his country's vast mineral reserves in exchange for support in ending the war. Rwanda also offered its own critical minerals.
And Soy. It is the beginning of the end for the trial of the billionaire music mogul P. Diddy, with closing arguments underway after 6 weeks of testimony. He had been facing a myriad of accusations, including kidnapping and arson, but they've been pared down to 5 core charges, which include 2 counts of sex trafficking. The prosecution have argued he used power, violence and fear to force men and women into drug-fueled sexual encounters and saw himself as above the law. He denies all the charges. Our North America correspondent Neda Tawfik sent this report from outside the court in New York.
Prosecutors ended telling the jury that Diddy was able to get away with his crimes because of his money, his power, his influence. That stops now. They told them it's time to hold him accountable. Their closing arguments lasted about hours. They allege that Diddy led an enterprise whose sole purpose was to serve him, to protect him. It was his kingdom, they said. They said his inner circle, consisting of his chief of staff and security guards, people who we haven't heard testify, all enabled him, and that it was his assistants, young people who didn't necessarily know about all of his crimes, who acted as foot soldiers, who didn't blink to do whatever was needed to keep him happy. Now, prosecutors have presented several crimes, including sex trafficking, drug distribution, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, to suggest that he ran this big racketeering enterprise. Of course, though, the focus has been on two women in particular, Jane and Cassie. Prosecutors say that Diddy knowingly recruited, enticed, transported Jane and Cassie using force and coercion to get them to do freak-offs, those prolonged sexual encounters where they were forced to have sex with male escorts. Now, hitting back at the defense suggestion that this was all consensual, the prosecutors told jurors not about criminalizing dysfunctional relationships and not about criminalizing unconventional sex. They say that Diddy wouldn't take no for an answer and had complete control over the women.
Neda Tawfik. Earlier this year, the leadership of the PKK militant group, which has waged a 40-year insurgency against Turkey, said it would disband and disarm. The group, which is a designated terrorist organisation in Turkey, the EU and the US, have been fighting for Kurdish rights. Turkey's president welcomed the move as a step towards a terror-free Turkey. Well, 40,000 people have been killed since the insurgency began. BBC Arabic's Salih Nabil reports from northern Iraq.
It wasn't an easy journey to the Kandil Mountains in the autonomous region of Kurdistan in northern Iraq. This remote, rugged area has been a stronghold for the outlawed Kurdish militants known as the PKK. It's a PKK-controlled area. Even the checkpoints we're meeting on the way are manned by PKK fighters. I can see from a distance a big picture for their ideological leader, Abdullah Öcalan. Now, a peace process may be on the horizon after Öcalan, jailed since 1999, announced that the group should disband and disarm. We've been turned back at the checkpoint, and we had to leave without doing any filming. It's still not clear what Turkey, who along with the UK, US and EU designate the PKK as a terrorist group, will agree on to end this conflict. Turkey says the group should disband and surrender its weapons unconditionally and without delay. The KJK, an umbrella group for the PKK, told us in a written statement that the PKK is sincere and serious about the peace process, insisting its leader must be freed, and calls on Turkey to meet a list of demands to move the process forward. But possibly, in a sign of the hurdles ahead, a senior local commander in the mountains told us in a written statement that in his view, disarmament is off the table. The PKK fought first for an independent homeland for the Kurdish people, who are spread across Turkey, Iran, Iraq and Syria, but more recently it called for more autonomy and greater Kurdish rights. In a bustling local market in the Kurdish city of Sulaymaniyah, people have mixed feelings. Some believe the time has come to enjoy a quiet life. They wish Turkish airstrikes on PKK strongholds in Iraq will stop once a deal is reached, while others, their dream of independence will never die and will be passed on to the next generations.
Salih Nabil reporting. Now, to the end of a chapter in fashion history, as Anna Winter, the editor of US Vogue, is stepping down after running the magazine for almost 4 decades. Amy Odell, author of Anna the Biography, explains why she may be going.
Vogue is a totally different publication in many ways from when she started in the summer of 1988. When she started, there were not websites that had to be maintained and flooded with content. When she started, there was no Instagram, there was no social media, there was no YouTube. Now she has to oversee all of that. The demands are much more relentless. She's 75 years old. You know, do any job forever.
Our culture and media editor Katie Razzle reports.
She's been the queen of the front row for more than 4 decades, the high priestess of fashion, known for her style, her drive, and of course, the dark glasses she was rarely seen without, something I asked her about when I interviewed her last year.
They help me see, and they help me not see, and they help me be seen and not be seen, so they're a prop.
Now, after 37 years as editor-in-chief of American Vogue, Anna Wintour is stepping back from direct control of the fashion Bible, although she was quick to dismiss any suggestion of that when we met.
Well, I have no plans to leave my job currently.
So does that mean you'd go on till 80, 85?
I'm worried about today, not tomorrow.
Famously, Wintour was said to be the inspiration for Miranda Priestley, the icy and terrifying magazine editor in The Devil Wears Prada, played by Meryl Streep.
What about accessories for April?
One thought I had was enamel, bangles, pendants, earrings.
No, we did that 2 years ago. What else?
Well, they're showing a lot of florals right now, so I was thinking I could
Florals? For spring. Groundbreaking.
Trends come and go, but Anna Wintour never went out of fashion. Born in London, she always championed British designers, but she made her name in New York, including as the impresario of the Met Gala, one of the most photographed events in the celebrity calendar. She isn't leaving Vogue entirely, though, remaining as its global editorial director, as well as chief content officer for parent company Condé Nast. This isn't the last we'll see of Anna Wintour.
Katie Razzle. Now, this last item will not self-destruct in 5 seconds. It will instead take you into the musical world of Lalo Schifrin, the composer who brought the world the alarm bells and thumping beat of the Mission Impossible theme music. Argentine-born Schifrin, who's died at the age of 93, was nominated 6 times for Oscars for writing music for films like Cool Hand Luke and Dirty Harry. Vincent Dowd reports.
From a musical family in Buenos Aires, as a child, Boris Claudio Schifrin studied classical piano. By his early 20s, he was in Paris playing jazz. Trumpet player Dizzy Gillespie commissioned Gillespiana. Lalo Schifrin moved to America and wrote for Hollywood. His percussive, jazzy style was in demand in the 60s and 70s in tough films such as Dirty Harry and the Steve McQueen classic Bullet. Schifrin said he only wrote a jazz score when a movie called for it.
Bullet lended itself because Steve McQueen plays the role of a very cool guy. The jazz beat and it plays a very important factor in the movie, but it's not only jazz.
The biggest hit was for the small screen. In 1966, with Mission Impossible, Schifrin tried to disquiet the audience with an unusual 5/4 time signature. In fact, audiences loved it. Re-recorded in 1996 for the first Tom Cruise film, the theme had a more obvious beat. Purists objected, but not the composer. Lalo Schifrin said the problem with his original had been you needed 5 legs to dance to it, and both versions helped make him very well off indeed.
Vincent Dowd reporting, and that is it for this edition of the Newsroom. Many thanks for listening. Goodbye.
This is the BBC World Service with The Grateful Team, part of Amazing Sports Stories.
What links the Soviet Union, basketball, and the iconic American rock band, The Grateful Dead?
You couldn't make this story up if you tried.
Lithuania has broken away from the Soviet Union and declared itself a fully independent sovereign state.
The 1992 Summer are just around the corner. But sporting freedom doesn't come cheap.
The men's basketball team has desperately been trying to raise funds to get there. One of their more unexpected donors is the Grateful Dead.
We love underdogs, so the band writes them a check.
But will the band's support be enough to take Lithuanian basketball to the Barcelona Olympics?
Bill Walton's The Grateful Team. Saturday at 17:30 GMT. Or search Amazing Sports Stories online or wherever you get your BBC podcasts.
Coming up on Heart and Soul with me, Emily Webb, a forgotten civil rights activist and her world-famous music.
We've come a long, long way together, through the hard times and the good.
Praise You is a dance song that soundtracked to TV shows and Hollywood films. But today I'm speaking to the 91-year-old and civil rights activist behind the lyrics who reveals the astonishing story that inspired them. That's after the BBC World Service News.
BBC News with David Harper. The US State Department says it's approved $30 million in funds for the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, the controversial US-Israeli-backed body set up to distribute aid in the territory. It's the first known direct US funding for the group. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed near its collection points, reportedly in Israeli firing. The Iranian foreign minister has acknowledged that what he called serious damage was done to the country's nuclear sites during the recent US and Israeli bombings. Abbas Araghchi said Iran's Atomic Energy Organization was carrying out a detailed assessment. His comments came as Washington doubled down on its assertion that its strikes on Iran severely undermined Tehran's nuclear ambitions. The White House says the US and China have reached a framework agreement on implementing the trade deal reached in Geneva this month. China agreed to ship rare earth metals to the US in exchange for better access to US computer chips. The leaders of France and Germany have called on the European Commission to reach a quick trade deal with Washington. It's less than 2 weeks till a US deadline for agreements to be reached and big tariffs to be avoided. A 49-year-old Canadian citizen who had permanent US residency has died in the custody of the US Immigration Enforcement Agency, the 8th person to die in its detention this year. Johnny Noviello was facing deportation over a drugs conviction. Japan has executed a death row inmate for the first time in 3 years. Takehiro Shiraishi was convicted of murdering 9 people in 2020. Both houses of Congress in Mexico have now approved legislation that bans entertainment events involving dolphins and other sea mammals. Campaigners have denounced the industry as cruel. The Grammy Award-winning film composer Lalo Schifrin has died at the age of 93. The Argentina-born Oscar nominee was best known for composing the theme to Mission Impossible, originally for TV, but re-recorded for the film franchise. BBC News.
We've come a long, long way together, through the hard times and the good. I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.
Do you recognise these? They're the opening lyrics to Praise You, a 90s dance anthem and signature song of the English DJ Fatboy Slim. The track's popped up in major Hollywood films, TV shows, commercials. If I'm at a wedding and it comes on, it's normally the song that gets everyone on the dance floor. But here's something you won't know. The singer behind it and the true meaning of the lyrics.
A lot of people have gone through things together, but I'm very specifically talking about African people being brought here and having lived here all these years. Even today, racism has mellowed a little, but it's still here.
Camille Yarborough first released the song 50 years ago. It was actually a product of the civil war, inspired by a family secret and a moment of spiritual.
And God said, that's good.
I'm sitting there and I'm getting these feelings. I'm saying, I was kind of rocking and I wanted to cry.
I'm Emily Webb and this is the documentary from the BBC World Service. For Heart and Soul, I'm coming to you from Harlem, New York City, just off Malcolm X Boulevard. Camille appears dressed in a gold lame gown with a matching scarf.
Dressing like this, but I messed up everything.
She's 91, and the walls of her apartment are a testament to her decades spent as an activist and performer.
Awards from Medgar Evers College.
There are about, 8 awards?
Yeah. community.
This isn't where she grew up, though. That was Chicago in the 1930s.
Millions of people of African ancestry fled the South after the Civil War, and so my family was one of the millions. In the summertime, Chicago, it's very, very hot. At night, some of us would sit on the front porch of the building, and we had dialogue. Now, over that, on the corner, there was a gospel group. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. And the singing started on 59th Street past us, and it goes to the bar on 58th Street. Now, the bar is blue, you understand? All of that music, the rhythm was strengthening us. Our culture is music, is art. And so even though we were separated from the motherland, it was in us, the African part of us.
The experiences that have shaped Camille's music were there from the get-go. The strains of gospel floating up through the porch, but also what was going on inside the house. Camille was one of 8 children, and family life wasn't tranquil. She didn't know much about her father's childhood. He'd grown up in the racially segregated South, something he didn't talk about. But the man she knew was full of rage.
Daddy would come home sometime, and he would be angry about something, and frequently he would take it out on Mama. And we would watch the physical attack, and sometimes we, too, were victims of that. And I wondered why. What's Daddy mad about?
What impact did that have on you? I mean, what sort of a little girl were you?
I resented it. We'd look at media around, and it'd say, you are violent people. That's why you got the violence. I didn't believe that. For some reason, I said, no, I'm here.
How much did you know when you were young about the history of what had been done to black people?
I didn't know very much. I felt it, but I didn't know. We didn't have the civil rights movement. Many churches in the South had it, but the Catholic church I was in, they didn't talk too much about that. And in that time, in the 40s, and then into the 50s, people of African ancestry were really, really in terror.
This was especially true in the South, where segregation was still alive and well. Racist laws meant that African American people were forced to live in certain neighborhoods, only given low-paid menial jobs, educated separately, and interracial marriage was illegal. Camille's sister had been engaged to a man who'd moved to Chicago from the southern state of Mississippi. When their relationship ended, he wanted to return home.
It was the Depression time, but he worked every kind of job he could. He bought a car. He bought a white Cadillac. And he was determined to go back down to Mississippi to show the people, you can do what I did. I came up here and I got work. And look at this car. He went back, he went in his neighborhood, he was driving around showing people, but he was light-skinned, you see. And his sister was even lighter-skinned, and his sister was sitting next to him, and the cop thought she was a white woman, and so it ended up with sister's former love was shot.
So your sister's fiancé was shot by the police?
Yeah, because he was black.
Do you remember hearing that news? How old were you?
I was very young. It was in the local paper in Chicago, the Chicago Defender. And I remember my father coming into the room where my grandmother and my mother were with the paper. I was a very aware child. I was listening.
Something that always brought Camille solace was music, and her childhood was steeped in it. Chicago in the 1950s became a destination for musicians.
There's a theater. They moved it. It was called the Regal Theater in Chicago, South Side. All of our best artists would come there. Lena Horne, Count Basie, all of the dancers came.
Unlike other theaters, the Regal was intended for an African-American audience. And when Camille was 14, performance there would be transformative. Josephine Baker in the US, the daughter of an African-American washerwoman, But after starting out as a dancer in New York, she moved to Paris, where she became an icon of the jazz age. And she used that platform to speak out about the racial injustice she'd witnessed and experienced. Camille read about her coming to Chicago and was intrigued.
Now, I'm coming from a family of 8 children. I'm number 7. My older sisters, my closest one to me was 11 years older than I was. And I didn't have anybody, to talk to. But there was this woman up there on the stage, and she was saying that America, you're not treating African Americans well. You're doing a bad job. And that's what I was feeling, and all of us were feeling, but we weren't saying it.
Tell me about her performance.
You couldn't see anything else. You couldn't think of anything else when she came on the stage. You saw a piece of fur, fabulous fur, come sliding onto the stage, and the light followed that. And everybody said, the theater was packed with people in our neighborhood because she was talking about racism. Nobody was going to contradict her. Nobody was going to stop her because her approach to the audience was loving. All kinds of things were going on.
I wonder what it was like for you, because you had this woman who you were like, oh, she's amazing, and she's so glamorous, and she's a singer, and to see that person speak about racism, what was it like for you?
It made me write an essay in school. That was my first essay. It's when I saw my idol, I saw myself. She faced issues, and she got up on the stage with all the glamour and everything.
It was a crossroads moment in Camille's life. She started wearing her hair in a ponytail, just like Josephine, and she now had a role model who used her art as activism. It wasn't long before Camille was following in Josephine's footsteps en route to New York as a member of a pioneering African-American dance troupe. You moved after a few years from dancing into acting, and you were, oh my goodness, you're in some incredibly cool, interesting productions, like the first production of To Be Young, Gifted and Black, the play that inspired the Nina Simone song. But I actually want to focus on another play you did called God's Trombone, Trumpets of the Lord. What was that about?
Poet, writer James Weldon Johnson wrote the play. He was fascinated by and in love with the church and the black sermons and the songs that we sang to keep us going.
I think it's opening night, isn't it?
Yes.
Tell me what happened.
Okay, let me tell you the whole thing. I'm in the choir, and the 4 ministers speak their sermons.
By the bank of the river he kneeled him down, and there the great God Almighty who lit the...
Something began happening to me deep inside emotionally. And by that time, I'm doing a rocking, and tears are there. But the next thing, I'm standing there wondering what is going on, because I was really not there for a while. Those who were in the church probably had more of an idea of what was happening. Those who were in the African spirituality knew what was happening. I didn't know.
What do you think they thought was happening?
She got the spirit.
They got the sense that you kind of got the spirit that you were taken over by something else.
Yes. And I was taken over by something else, and it had to do with culture. It had to do with our people. That moment told me that there's something about myself that I had to find out. So I called my mother and father, and they sounded as if they'd been waiting for me to call.
One thing that really comes across when you speak to Camille is how important it was for her to learn her family's history. And you can trace a lot of that back to the following conversation. To warn you, you're about to hear a description of sexual violence involving a child. When you had that conversation with your parents, your father opened up about something that had happened to him. Mm-hmm. What did he tell you?
He said that he had been raped by some white men. They were in Blockton, Alabama, where my father was born and raised. His father worked in a coal mine. Mother died when he was 2. The stepmother did washing for the local white people. Daddy would go with her. So they were walking down the road, and a wagon of these white men were going down the road past them. And when they got up to a certain place, the road turned, and when they got up there, the men had gotten off of their truck or whatever it was and went up further into the woods, and that's where he was raped. And he said it was so painful he fainted. He became unconscious.
How old was he?
He was young. I see, maybe his early teens, maybe 10, 12. But when he came home, his stepmother, who was also raped at that point, and his father found out what happened, he wouldn't accept it. He asked them, what did they do? What did the woman, his wife, his stepmother, do to make these white men attack you? And then he was beaten because his father, if you accuse a white man of raping a woman and a black boy, they beat you, they lynch you, that you had to leave town. So he told them, don't say anything.
I mean, it's so horrific hearing you describe it now, and I cannot imagine what it was like for you, hearing that from your father and hearing that was his experience in his childhood. What effect did it have on you?
It made me understand why he was so angry. It gave context to everything that happened later on, and watching him trying to make something of himself. Daddy was always trying to do that. With his damaging, with his brutality, he was still trying to help. That's why I wrote the songs that I wrote.
Because you ended up writing this song called But It Comes Out Mad. What did you want to say?
I was saying from the point of the view of a woman during the Depression when work was very scarce. Daddy told me he was given $1 for a week's work, $1. This is during the Depression. And that caused a lot of anger because the men, if they had a family, they couldn't support it, and they were degraded always. So the woman had to say, I don't think no less of him because he can't find a job. I know the kind of man he is, and I know what they do to a black man out there. Those are the lyrics to that song. Because every time you look at them, it's like you're accusing them, hitting them. Then they start to hit you back. Ooh. That's one reason why we were violent towards each other, because he couldn't hit the racists. But when he talks to me...
You're listening to Heart and Soul from the BBC World Service. I'm Emily Webb, coming to you from Harlem, New York City, with the singer, dancer and civil rights activist Camille Yarbrough. But It Comes Out Mad wasn't the only song inspired by Camille's conversation with her father. The opening lyrics to Take Your Praise are now world famous, immortalized in the 90s dance track Praise You. But there was a lot more to the original song, and Camille wrote it with a very specific audience in mind.
I wanted to praise black men because I'd seen them. And my father was an example, because at times he was so good. He was a good person, but damaged. We've come a long, long way together, through the hard times and the good. And I'm talking to him. I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should. You're so rare. You're so fine. And I'm so glad you're mine. You make me glad I'm a woman. How many times we bump heads because of our history? They raised cattle and they raised us. They forced us to mate. They forced us to have children. And I was trying to get over them. I'm so glad I'm a woman because you're a feeling, thinking man. You're not all those other things that have been bred into you as an enslaved person and forced to do things. That's not who you are. You're so rare, and you're so fine, and I'm so very, very, very glad you're mine. I didn't say black man because it wouldn't get any play. I write Take Your Praise as a love letter to men of African ancestry.
So what you're saying is that you wanted the song to be this love letter to black men, but you couldn't say that at the time.
I could not fully say it, and I hope that they would understand.
So the songs that you wrote formed your first album, The Iron Pot Cooker. You released it in 1975. Why that name?
I had been reading about certain healing people in Nigeria in particular, women who traveled from village to village as medical people, doctors. And they had herbs, or they found things which were good for your health, and they put them in an iron pot because that's what they had. I'm an iron pot cooker, and I considered my words healing because I'm telling our story.
How was the album received after you released it?
The radio stations, they did not want that. I was not accusing anybody, but I was talking about backstory. But it comes out mad. Why does it come out mad? It always goes to the oppression. So they were tired of protest, and they considered my album a protest album. They didn't play any of them, except a few stations here and there.
How do you feel you were labeled at the time by them?
A troublemaker. I was a woman. As the sister says, I'm black, I'm African ancestry, and I talk about things which cause people to be uncomfortable.
With the radio station shut off to her, Camille took her music to the student unions of historically black colleges across the US. She also joined forces with the civil rights activist Reverend Al Sharpton.
In the last 30 days, there has been 6 racially motivated crimes in New York.
I would go to his weekly meetings, but I would also go when they went to protest.
Because another song from that album is called All It, and it's very much about, you know, the civil rights movement, about the treatment of African-American people at the time. Tell me about that and about performing that at civil rights events.
It was where I was supposed to be. We were talking about the same thing from a different perspective, but really, this is happening. My question was, why is happening? So it was always backstory with me. Last night, 24 policemen at my door. People inside wouldn't let them in. They ended up dead in the cooling bin. Dead in the cooling bin.
Camille recorded another album and continued to perform and protest. But as the years passed, the bookings dried up. Let's fast forward to the late 1990s. You're living in Harlem in New York. What is life like for you?
I was still active in the movement. Whatever was happening, I was usually there. But I was also out of work a long time. And so there were times when I didn't have anything. I had no money. I had some cheese. I looked in the refrigerator. There was some cheese. And I had a little bit of wine. And I drank that and felt good inside. But there were those days when I just didn't have anything until I got employment at City College as a dance teacher.
So it was at this time you kind of received this telephone call out of the blue. What do you remember about where you were and what was said?
I was going out and the phone rang and I picked it up. They said, you know that Fatboy Slim has sampled, and I didn't know what sampled meant. I said, what is that? Sampled your song. What song? Take Your Praise. Praise You Now. I said, really? And then they asked me, could they send me a copy? And they did right away. And I listened to, I said, oh, wow. He put some, you know, it's not the message, but he put rhythm to it, which is good. It would cause people, some people, to listen to the message. We've come a long, long way together through the hard times.
The call was from Fatboy Slim, real name Norman Cook's team. He'd stumbled across an old vinyl of Camille's in a London market. He had taken your voice at the start of Take Your Praise, and he'd mixed it in with a whole other bunch of stuff, and he turned it into this electronic song, this dance song. When was the moment? Well, I mean, maybe there were a few moments when you realized that this song was getting pretty big.
One day I went to Bloomingdale's, the store, the big department store here. And I come up the stairs, and as I open the door, I hear my voice singing, we've come a long, long way together. And I stopped. I think people thought I was crazy. And I looked around, and I said, that's me. And I went over to some salespeople, and I laughed. I said, that's my song.
How
did they react? Everywhere. How did they looked at me like I was crazy. But then it began to be heard every place over here. But it was usually at football games, sports, and then some shows began to do it.
I mean, it was so big. But yeah, it was in Cruel Intentions, which is this massive teen movie.
First, I think. Yeah, Cruel Intentions.
You know what your problem is? You take yourself way too seriously.
I do not.
Yes, you do. You should try to lighten up.
I am like, can we drop this?
It was humongous, as they say. It was marvelously huge. And then I began getting statements, royalty statements. It changed my life completely. And I said, you know, this is something. This is something. I said, yes, thank you, Fat Boys.
The night of the MTV Video Music Awards, 1999, you're at home in New York, and you're watching the show.
Yeah.
Talk me through that.
I should have been there. That's what I thought. It was amazing. Just, is this real? That's what I'm saying.
Because they performed the song that night, and they picked up 3 awards.
Yeah, they did. They did. They picked up awards.
And the winner is Fat Boy Slim.
The song didn't just change Camille's life, but Fatboy Slim's too. To this day, it's still his biggest hit. Camille says she didn't have any direct contact with him at the time, but later they had a call.
I just told him thank you, and I appreciate it. It was very muted. It was quiet.
What did he say?
He never said thank you for writing the song. It was not that kind of a conversation. I wish it had been, because it deserved to be.
Do you think he knew? I mean, do you think he knew the context in which he'd written the song, also what the song was about?
I don't think so. He saw it as music. It was sound. It was rhythm. And then other people did it. Rita or somebody.
Rita Ora.
Yes.
It does make you think about how many people know it's you, though, because the way that I came across you and I came across your music is that I was listening to a random playlist and Take Your Praise came on, and I was like, oh, this sounds familiar. and then I ended up tracking you down and on Facebook or whatever and finding you. But that must be quite a strange thing, because it is such a well-known song, and a lot of people just sort of assume it's Fatboy Slim singing.
I've heard that, and I've seen that, and I would like for the song, for what it says, to have been honored. I want us to know it. I want people of African ancestry to know what the song is about. That's why I wrote it.
It's been 50 years. Yeah, this year, since the song's release. 1975, 2025. You are now 91? 91. Mm-hmm. What message do you want to pass on to the next generation?
You cannot live a good life if you don't know who you are. My spirituality begins in my history. My ancestry is everything to me. My connection to it, that gives me life. And so that is what drives me. Everything goes back to who I am.
And what role does music play in this?
Music is my soul speaking. That's all. And it tells me what to do. Storytellers are perception changers. They are rearrangers. They are mind evolvers. They are problem solvers. They are beast eaters, soul excreters, void fillers, and bile spillers. That's what it's about, storytelling.
Camille Yarborough, 91 and still going strong, speaking to me from her apartment in Harlem, New York. We got in touch with Fatboy Slim, or Norman Cook's team, about Camille's interview. They said Norman Cook has spoken with Camille on numerous occasions and has always expressed warmth and appreciation for both her work and her generous attitude towards his sampling of it. He has thanked her many times, both in private conversations and in interviews, where he has also discussed how Take Your Praise originated as a civil rights song. I'm Emily Webb, and this episode of Heart and Soul was produced and presented by me.
This is the BBC World Service with Lubna Care, exploring Pakistan's diabetes crisis.
Numbers collected by the International Diabetes Federation are staggering.
If this is not addressed, then this will be a crisis beyond what we can imagine over the next decade.
Diabetes in Pakistan, a nation's struggle. Thursday at 8:30 and 19 GMT. At bbcworldservice.com, people fixing the world with Myra Anubi.
We'll be going for a hike in Mexico and climbing under a bridge in Germany to discover better ways of managing the growing numbers of stray dogs and town pigeons.
Newsday is next. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello and welcome to Newsday on the BBC World Service with James Copnell and Catherine Garahunga. Great to have you with us.
The United Nations says it's deeply concerned by the violence that left 16 people dead and hundreds injured in nationwide protests in Kenya. We'll hear from the mother of one of the victims.
He was shot in the head. The bullet went right through. I'm very bitter about what happened. He was my firstborn, the one who supported me. We'll get a response to allegations of police brutality from a Kenyan government spokesperson.
As the US gives money to a controversial new aid group in Gaza, we'll hear from a resident of the territory who says the shooting continues for those queuing for aid.
Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, brings us the latest from inside Iran after the war with Israel.
And we'll hear from the trial of hip-hop superstar Diddy too. First though, this news.
Hello, I'm David Harper with the BBC News. The United States is to give $30 million in funding to the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, a controversial US and Israeli-backed body set up to distribute aid in Gaza. The GHF has been operating in the Strip since the end of May, following an 11-week aid blockade by Israel. Jake Kwan reports from Washington.
This is the first known U.S. government funding of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. Israel sees the organization as key to undermining Hamas' control of Gaza, but the UN and major aid groups have refused to cooperate with the food distribution system, accusing it of weaponizing aid. The group uses private U.S. military and logistics firms to bring food to Palestinians at what they call secure sites. But the UN has said that more than 410 Palestinians have been killed by Israeli gunfire or shelling since the group began work in late May.
The Iranian foreign minister has admitted what he called serious damage was done to the country's nuclear sites during the recent US and Israeli bombings. Abbas Araghchi said Iran's Atomic Energy Organization was carrying out an assessment. His comments came as Washington doubled down on its insistence that its strikes badly undermined Tehran's nuclear ambitions. Top US leaders have been briefing all 100 senators, Republicans, and the airstrike. Republicans said the airstrikes had clearly been successful, but one Democrat, Chris Murphy, said dialogue was the only answer.
Ultimately, the only way to truly constrain Iran's nuclear program is diplomacy. You cannot bomb knowledge out of existence. No matter how many scientists you kill, there are still people in Iran who know how to work centrifuges. And if they still have enriched uranium and they still have the ability to use centrifuges, then you're not setting back the program by years. You're setting back the program by months. The only path forward is diplomacy.
The White House said the United States and China have agreed on a framework aimed at implementing the trade deal reached earlier this month. A Trump administration official said the framework lays the groundwork for expediting rare earth shipments from China to the US. Earlier, President Trump said he had signed a deal with Beijing on Wednesday without giving further details. France's President Macron and Germany's Chancellor Merz have said the EU must reach a quick trade deal with the United States. They were speaking after an EU summit in Brussels with less than 2 weeks to go before a US ultimatum to reach deals and ward off hefty tariffs. The EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said EU-US talks would continue.
Today, we received the latest US document for further negotiations. We are assessing it. So our message today is clear. We are ready for a deal. At the same time, we are preparing for the possibility that no satisfactory agreement is reached, and we will defend the European interest as needed. In short, all options remain on the table.
This is the latest world news from the BBC. The The UN Special Rapporteur for Belarus has warned of dire human rights situation there. Niels Muzienieks told the UN Human Rights Council that conditions were continuing to deteriorate with no signs of improvement. He said he was most concerned about the political persecution waged by the authorities. A Belarusian rights group says more than 1,000 political dissidents. Japan has executed a death row inmate for the first time in 3 years. Takahiro Saraishi was arrested in 2017 after body parts were found in his flat. He was sentenced to death for murdering 9 people in 2020. The 34-year-old was dubbed the Twitter killer after he admitted to approaching his victims on the social media platform, luring them to his apartment, then murdering and dismembering them. The Justice Minister Keisuke Suzuki confirmed the execution.
This case caused great shock and discomfort to the public, with the loss of 9 victims and precious human lives in the span of 2 months for the extremely selfish reasons of satisfying his own sexual and financial desires.
The lower house of Congress in Mexico has approved legislation that bans entertainment events involving dolphins and other mammals such as orcas and sea lions. Dolphin shows where tourists pay to swim and take pictures with the animals are a popular attraction in Mexican resorts. In a rare show of unity in Mexican politics, the Wildlife Reform Bill won unanimous support in the Chamber of Deputies. The Grammy Award-winning film composer Lalo Schifrin has died at the age of 93. Born in Argentina, Lalo Schifrin wrote era-defining music for films such as Cool Hand Luke and Dirty Harry. But his best-known piece was for television, the theme to Mission Impossible. He said his brief was for a theme that's exciting, promising, but not too heavy, and anticipates action to follow. That's the latest BBC News.
Thank you for that news. Hello and welcome to Newsday on the BBC World Service with Catherine Byaruhanga and James Cocknell. In the programme today, allegations of police brutality as demonstrations in Kenya turned deadly. We'll hear about the US-China trade deal, and from inside Gaza as the US provides money to a controversial new organisation delivering aid there. Our correspondent reports from Iran, which is recovering from the 12-day war with Israel, and we'll get the latest on the trial of rap mogul Diddy. You can send us your thoughts on anything you hear. Our number for your WhatsApp and text messages is +44 77 86 20 50 85.
Kenya's Interior Minister has denied that the police used excessive force during nationwide protests in which at least 16 people were reportedly killed, describing them as terrorism disguised as dissent. Kipchumba Murkomen thanked security agencies for their remarkable restraint amid extreme provocation, he said, and credited them with helping to foil an attempted coup. On Wednesday, thousands took to the streets across Kenya to voice anger with President William Ruto's government and to demand an end to police brutality. As well as the deaths, more than 400 people were injured, among them this man who said he was just passing by.
My name's Amos Muli, and honestly speaking, I was not among the protestants. I was just taking my phone to the charging. Then, unfortunately, I received a bullet on the left arm, whereby it just pierced through. I was just passing by. I was not protesting. The police officers were just shooting, I think randomly. There is a guy who was like 20 meters away from me. He was shot and fell down. That thing is still disturbing me.
Nyambura is mother of 19-year-old David Mwangi. She told the BBC that he was a bystander who had gone to pick up his younger brother from a tuition class and was shot in the head in Nairobi.
He was shot in the head. The bullet went right through. We even had the bullet. Those who were nearby picked it up and brought it to us. I'm very bitter about what happened. He was my firstborn, the one who supported me. Whenever I needed water fetched, he'd do it. I sell sweet potatoes, and he always helped me carry the sacks from the market. I depend on him. I'm deeply bitter with whoever did this.
Jacinta Gathoni is the mother of 17-year-old Dennis Njuguna. She told the BBC that he was coming home from school when he was shot in Molo in Nakuru.
My son had big dreams. I used to say that once he finished school, he'd be a great help at home. But to hear that your child has been shot as he was innocently coming from school, it breaks you. I'm in so much pain. I haven't even been able to go see him. I've just been at home, grieving.
Some harrowing testimonies from Kenya there. Well, the UN's Human Rights Office has called for calm and restraint in the country, stressing the right to peaceful assembly. Kenya's Independent Police Oversight Authority says it's launched an investigation into the deaths. I put some of the allegations of police brutality to Kenya's Deputy Government Spokesperson, Gabriel Mutuma.
Our constitution allows for peaceful and unarmed demonstrations and picketing. But what we've seen recently, that has not been the case. We have police that, number one, has its tools of know what to do and what not to do. If there's a death that has occurred through the hands of the police, it is not something that the government tolerates. We have policemen who are in court today, and we have those that are going through the disciplinary mechanisms, as well as in the past we have seen policemen who have actually been taken through the judicial system and have actually been jailed. There have been those cases. But at the same time, we need to be cognizant to this fact that chaos cannot produce order, and you're saying the 16 deaths is through gun bullets. That cannot be confirmed, has not been confirmed yet, and it's something that we are following with the police to ascertain what the facts are, because probably what you're getting is from other sources which may actually be giving contradictory information.
This information has been confirmed by the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. This is a state-funded organization.
It is the same commission that told us last year that 300 Kenyans were killed in a place called Githurai. And actually, BBC confirmed that last year. But it happened not to be true. So that's why I'm saying until we hear it from the sources that are allowed to give such information, then we can confirm. And if you've seen in the last few months, there's nothing the government has been hiding.
There's nothing the government has been hiding. So why did you shut down media houses that had been showing live coverage of what was happening on the streets?
This is not the first time we've done so.
So a lot of people who are watching what's going on, they would say the government doesn't want the public to know what's happening.
That's not it. There has to be an element of control when the media is showing gory pictures. Let me give you a scenario. I was in the US during September 11th, where bodies were coming on top of buildings. No media house carried, because they have a code that they follow. And that's why the government must come in to ensure that that goriness is not shown, because it actually creates a capita that everybody thinks it's normal. So the government must come in and ensure that some of these gory pictures and gory narratives are actually cut off.
Mr. Mutuma, these scenes are not caused by an explosion, a terrorist attack, for example, as was the case with 9/11. This is violence by the police, by state security forces. And we've seen the images, we've seen the image of one trader being shot directly in the head by the police. So you're hiding police crimes.
No. The person who did that has been held to account. The person who did that. The other thing that you mentioned, which I don't think it's really true, Catherine, is for you to say that all the images you show were caused by the police. Did you not see police that were injured and hurt? They are there. Did you not see all the businesses that were destroyed? They are there. Did you not see where issues of goons attacking people who are peaceful? They are there. Today, this morning, we're hearing of cases of rape by those goons, people who went and barricaded the roads to create violence. They are there. So I think what we need to get right is all of us must be subjected to the Constitution and the laws of the land. If these demonstrations are going to be or to follow laws of the land, then they must be peaceful and unarmed. You cannot and destroy people's businesses. Chaos will not produce the order we want as a country.
That was Kenya's Deputy Government Spokesperson, Gabriel Mutuma. In about an hour's time, we'll be speaking to one of the leaders of Kenya's National Human Rights Commission. Of course, they've been investigating some of those allegations of police brutality, and we'll be hearing from them. So join us if you can.
Now, President Trump has said that the US has signed a trade deal with China, but he hasn't given many details. Our North America editor, Sarah Smith, is in Washington.
It's rather peculiar, I have to say. Donald Trump was giving a speech at an event promoting his big tax-cutting legislation when he just slipped in the phrase, we signed with China yesterday. And then the only more detail he gave was, with this deal, we're opening China up. And then he moved on to something else. So we've no idea if this is a comprehensive trade deal, if this relates to just one sector, or is maybe just a kind of heads of agreement of where they're going to go from here. And what is so odd about it is the one other trade deal that has been signed off in America was the one with the United Kingdom, and that was announced with great fanfare in the Oval Office, with Keir Starmer on speakerphone talking to the president. They made a real fuss about that. So if they really have signed a big trade deal with China, why would he slip in a mention of it and then just move on to something else? So we're waiting for more details, but I have to say it's all rather odd.
Well, for more, we can speak to our business presenter, Katie Silver, in Singapore. So, Katie, is there a deal? Isn't there a deal?
I know. I enjoyed that she started with it's peculiar and ended with it's rather odd, which is what we're all grappling with here in Singapore as well. The other question too is whether or not it's the same deal that's been agreed in London earlier this month. So we have since heard from the White House, and an official has said that both sides have reached an understanding on issues including expediting rare earth shipments to the United States. And remember, that was one of the sticking points ahead of the all-important discussions in London. We saw, for example, Washington accusing China of slow-walking, what they called slow-walking, the approvals of sending rare earths, which of course are used in everything from MRI scanners to mobile phones, sending them into the Washington market, so potentially into the US. So that potentially that's if that has been part of it, maybe it's a formalization of what was agreed in London. We are, of course, also waiting for more information about what's going to happen come early August. That's when the deadline hits from the three months from the discussions that were had in Geneva, where we saw both sides choosing to, for 3 months, reduce tariff rates on each other. It's now 30% for goods that go from China into the US, 10% for goods that go the other way. So we're still waiting to hear on that. Maybe more information may come out about this so-called deal that was signed yesterday, and maybe that's going to include some information when it comes to the tariffs. But at the same time, we are also seeing other countries as well, James, trying to broker their own deals. We're seeing, for example, word that Thailand's finance minister is going to be heading over there, travelling to the US for trade talks, and he's certainly not the only one.
All right, Katie Silver, thank you very much indeed.
And now let's get the latest sports with Rebecca Adams.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Well, Erling Haaland scored his 300th top-level career goal as Manchester City beat Juventus 5-2 in Orlando at the Club World Cup. They'll play Saudi Pro League side Al Hilal in the last 16. Last year's Wimbledon champion Barbara Krejcikova has withdrawn from Eastbourne with a thigh injury just 4 days before the start of her title defence. She pulled out before her quarter-final against France's Varvara Gracheva. Lando Norris says that he needs to stop making as many mistakes to give himself a chance of winning the F1 driver's title this year. The